Erev Tov and welcome everyone. As we've been learning Torah for a long time together, we know there's so many beautiful ideas in the Torah, so many ideas that inspire, that are universal, that have inspired other religions. But at the same time, in our rich tradition, there are ideas that are troubling to us, that are challenging, whether they seem outdated or even, let's say, God forbid, but even unethical and really difficult. And what do we do with them? And one of the interesting things is we might think, well, this is the 21st century and we have these modern ideals, which are not bad. It's good that, ideas and morality progresses, but that's challenging the morality of the Torah is a new thing. It's not. If you go all the way back to the Talmud, so we're talking 1500 years plus, even the rabbis had certain ideas in the Torah, which they were deeply uncomfortable with. The idea of something called in Hebrew, the ben sorer umoreh, the wayward and rebellious child, which is a child that, again, the Torah doesn't define it precisely, but this rebellious child that would be publicly put to death by his parents. That should make you feel, not should, but it probably makes you feel a little, ugh. Well, the rabbis of the Talmud seem to be troubled by it as well, and they argue about it, and they make it almost impossible to ever do it. The child has to be like a through and through, like Scarface, a real criminal, to even consider this. And even then, even if he's the worst child in the world, the parents have to literally look, sound like each other, and be the same height. And that's based on them reading the verses hyper literally, but it's clearly from a place of, we cannot just accept this. However, it begs the bigger question, which is when we are presented with something in our tradition which we don't know what to do with, and it really pushes against our morality, what do we do? One idea is, of course, to just reject it. And we know that plenty of religions and plenty of people, certainly in modern times, simply do that. They just throw the baby out with the bathwater, or they pick and choose what they feel comfortable with and what resonates with them. And I understand that. I understand why they're doing that. But there's another way to approach it, which is to take the things that are troubling to us and try and understand where they come from, understand what they mean, and then to refine and redefine, meaning to say, and the rabbis do this all the time. That's what the wayward and rebellious child, they say, no. The Torah wasn't actually saying that. If you read the Torah it doesn't mean it literally. One would never put their child to death. They actually say in the Talmud, it's there as an opportunity to learn Torah and to think about how to raise one's children, but no one would ever actually do that. And then the final word in that conversation is a rabbi who says, oh no, it actually happened and I sat on the grave of a child who was put to death. So that's a conversation for another day. But again, one of the things, particularly from not just the Orthodox tradition, but for somebody who wants to live in the tradition and value it and understand that it has to change and still protect the underlying core and the sacred nature of our tradition, sometimes you have to read things carefully and again, come out without throwing everything away, come out with a new understanding. So what we're going to look at tonight is an idea which can seem very, very troubling, and see how the rabbis deal with it, how they refine it, and then how they apply it to today. But the areas I named this class, Jewish ethics in a non-Jewish world, the topic we're specifically looking at is the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the business world. And one of the questions often comes up, there are all of these mitzvot protecting Jews about returning property, not stealing, etc., like that. And the question is, do they apply equally to non-Jews? And that's the conversation that we are going to explore tonight. And again, see how the rabbis deal with it without rejecting the tradition. How can you live within the tradition, respect the tradition, value the tradition, but still allow your ethical concerns to be part of the conversation? Now, the way I'm going to present this is a little different than I usually do. The source for this starts in the Mishnah, and then we'll look at the commentary from the Talmud, but rather than bring in the translation, which I did bring for the second half of the class and the later sources, I just brought the straight text, which I'll read and translate as I go along. And partly I think it's a little different. It's exciting to try something a little outside of our comfort zone. And also the translation, which is excellent, it's a perfect translation, is very wordy, and it would take up another 3 or 4 pages just to include it here in the text. And there's also big sections that I wanted to excise just for time's sake. So having said all that, let's jump in, and the uncomfortable thing won't come right away, but when we get to it, we'll sit with it for a moment And the other thing to think about is try and understand, why would the rabbis say this? Because they're not actually quoting something from the Torah. This is a rabbinic idea. So it starts here with these letters in Hebrew. Again, if you can read Hebrew, follow along. If not, I'll explain as we go. But these four letters, Mem, Taf, Nun, Yud, start from Matnitin, which means it's a Mishnah. So it's from around the year 220 C Common Era. So the Mishnah says, so this is a very early source, En portin lo mitevat hamochasin velo mikis shel gabaim. Ve'en notlin mehem tzedakah, aval notelhu mitoch beto o min hashuk. So what it says is, when the tax collector, so the tax collector or the customs collector, there's two different jobs here, but people who basically their job is to take money from you, come to your house asking for money, you give them the money. You give them whatever they ask, but if you have a 20 and they only ask for 10, you cannot take 10 back from them. So if I give them a $20 bill, I can't get change from them, not from their pocket, not from the box that they collect the taxes in. However, if I go to their personal private house and I ask for them for some money, then it's totally fine. Or if I just run into them, not when they're not on the job, just run into them in public, again, I'm like, can you lend me $5? That's fine. So what's the difference between them collecting taxes and their own personal money? And the understanding here, as comes out in the Talmud and other commentaries, is that they are seen as crooks and criminals. And anyone who's listened to the Beatles song Tax Man, or just in general lives in this world and knows what taxes are, everybody thinks tax people are criminals. Now, of course, that's not true. They do a valuable service, and our IRS is deeply underfunded, and they're amazing people. But the idea that people who collect taxes or customs on goods, etc., like that, are criminals trying to rip you off, that's the perspective of this Mishnah. Okay, so we could let that sit for a moment. We could unpack why that is. We'll come back to it. But that's the Mishnah right there, is that these tax collectors, you still have to pay them, but anything that goes into their coffers is considered basically stolen money. And think about that. You have to pay them, but they're basically stealing from you. That's why you can't get change from them, because you're basically taking money that technically was stolen from someone else. That's the idea here. So now the Gemara jumps into it and does something very typical for the Gemara, the second line, Tana. So this is a source that was written around the same time as the Mishnah, but wasn't included in the codification of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So it's about the same age, has similar, but not the same authority. And this one says, Aval noten lo dinar v'noten lo et hasha'ar. And it says you can give them a coin and you can take the change from it. So this seems to be arguing with it. Is it no, you are allowed to make change with the tax collectors. They're not criminals. So the question is this, which of these sources is the correct one? Are tax collectors all criminals? So now we get into the rabbis trying to figure out, why would we consider them criminals? So next thing is a question. Umuchasin, and these tax collectors or customs collectors, Ve'ha'amar Shmuel, Dina de Malchuta Dina, and didn't we say the law of the king is the law, which is that since kings technically own the land on which people live, they have the authority to charge taxes. And the way this in general means is that unless this local civil law explicitly goes against Jewish law, like if it's forbidden to circumcise, if it's forbidden to have kosher slaughtering, unless it's that, you follow the local thing. So even if you say copyright isn't in Jewish law, it doesn't matter. The law of the land is you follow copyright. You don't download things illegally. Great. So if that's true, then what could be illegal about collecting taxes? The king has every right to charge taxes. So now we come in with an idea, which is that in general, tax collectors aren't criminal, but these aren't your regular tax collectors. So Amar Rav Chanina bar Kahana Amar Shmuel b'moches she'en lo kitzva. Opinion one, this is a tax collector who is charged with taking 10% of your income, but instead he asks you for 15%. So you should pay him whatever it is, $100, but when he asks for $150, that's him trying to rip you off. So some of the money is legitimate tax collector sent by the king, but he's also trying to rip you off and skim some off to the top. That's what we're talking about. Or opinion two, Devei Rav Yanai, which is the school or the house of this Rav Yanai, Amre, so his students, they say, B'moches ha'omed me'alav. it's different, which is that rather than him being appointed by the king, he appointed himself. He stands on his own. He basically just comes to your house with a sword and a gun and says, I'm collecting taxes now. Who appointed you? I appointed myself. Do you want to get shot? So in both of these cases, the idea is that tax collectors are not criminals, but which, going back to those debating sources, you can take change, you can't take change. If they are appointed by the king and they're doing their job according to what the king said, totally legal above board. But if they weren't appointed or they're trying to rip you off, then they're criminals, and every penny they take is considered ill-gotten gains. That's actually fine. If we ended right there, it'd be like, that's a great resolution. That's a reasonable thing. If we live in a country like one of my professors, we're trying to think where he's from, but he's from a country where if you got pulled over for a speeding ticket, you'd always have an envelope with a bribe in it. That's how that country ran. So if you live in a place with corrupt people, this makes sense. Generally, we don't. Our tax system is annoying to some, but it's legit. But then they go on and they start bringing some they bring some interesting examples of what you do with corrupt officials. So here in these brackets, kilaim, the Torah forbids a Jew to wear any kind of garment, clothing, with a mixture of wool and linen together. It's forbidden under any circumstances, unless, of course, it's to save a life, or if you're going through customs at the airport and you know that they're going to rip you off for every sweater, what you can do is wear a linen sweater and then a wool sweater on top of it, so you don't get charged for all the sweaters. You pile clothes on top of each other, which technically breaks a Torah mitzvah, but because you know the tax collector is trying to rip you off, you're not wearing the clothes as clothing, you're wearing them to get by a corrupt official. The next one is if he's trying to steal some of your grains, you can lie and say your grains are truma, they're promised to the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and he wouldn't be stealing from you, he'd be stealing from the temple. And the third one is you could say, I'm delivering this to the king, an outright lie to stop this corrupt individual. So this is part of an interesting conversation about when it's appropriate to lie, but okay, this is consistent. If they're corrupt, no problem. And again, if we ended there, we'd say this is a good class in and of itself. Rabbi, one of your Jewish ethics business series ones, we could end there. We don't. So the ellipses there is just, that was the whole section that talked about each of these cases. But now after these ellipses, we get to Rav Ashi. And Rav Ashi Amar, he said, Moches Knani Tanya. We're not saying that all tax collectors are corrupt and then we consider them thieves. We're only saying that the tax collectors are corrupt are the ones who are not Jewish. Now the phrase here, Knani, technically means a Canaanite, but it's not clear what the original word in the Gemara would have been because there's censorship and non-Jews who had a chance to censor the Talmud didn't always like it. So maybe Knani was the original, maybe Goy, just meaning a non-Jew, someone from another nation. There's lots of possible words that have been there, but it means someone who's not Jewish. So this is starting to get uncomfortable, that any tax collector who's a non-Jew has no right to take money from a Jew, and if they do, they're considered a thief. And it goes on, and it brings an example, or a Kanani, and then Tanya. It's taught in a Baraitic source, meaning around the time of the Mishnah. Yisrael v'Kanani anas, shabau ladin. So a Jew and a non-Jew come before a court, and hold on to your, not hold your horses, but hold on to your hats for this one. Imata, so you're the judge. Imata yachol lezakehu, if you're able to find in the favor of the Jew, find him innocent or find whatever it is, find in the Jew's favor, bedine Yisrael, according to Jewish law, zakehu. So if they come before you in civil local law, would rule for the non-Jew, go to Jewish law. Ve'amor lo, and say to the non-Jew, kachtinenu bedina, oh, this is our Jewish law and this is what we'll go by. Bedine knanim zakehu. But if civil law would help the Jew, again, see how unbelievably unfair and insulting and troubling this is. Don't do anything possible to find for the Jew and make sure that the non-Jew doesn't win in this case. Oh, according to your civil law, your non-Jewish law, the Jew wins, no matter what. And this is where, again, really it's troubling. Ve'im lav, but if you can't do it according to either law, there's no legal way, like it's 100% clear that the non-Jew should win this case, ba'in la ba'akifin. You should come upon him with trickery, basically deception. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael, who in general is a brilliant rabbi and not necessarily a bad person, but here you're like, I don't know about this one. But then comes along our hero, Rabbi Akiva, who Lag BaOmer, he is the hero of Lag BaOmer. Rabbi Akiva Omer, En bayin ala ba'akifin mipnei kiddush Hashem. He says, do not use deception. But he doesn't say because it's illegal to cheat a non-Jew. He says because of this phrase, kiddush Hashem, which means to sanctify or make special, holy, good the name of God. In other words, if the non-Jew finds out that you're trying to cheat him in court, and then he tells all his non-Jewish friends, or even the Jews find out that the judge is being dishonest, this will be a disgrace to the Jewish people, and more specifically, the name of God. So because you don't want that to happen, then no problem. And then it continues on. Rabbi Akiva, Tama de'ika kiddush Hashem. His reason is where there's an issue of kiddush Hashem, i.e. someone will find out that the judge is being dishonest and deceptive. Haleka, but if it's not there, haleka kiddush Hashem ba'in. But if no one's going to find out and everybody's in on the conspiracy, go ahead and cheat. So Rabbi Akiva, we're not so happy with his reason here, although we'll come back to him. So I'm going to pause there for a moment just to let this all kind of sink in. We started with an interesting case. Tax collectors seem to be criminals. No, they're not, only when they're corrupt officials. But then we introduced a troubling thing, which is, no, it's not about whether they're corrupt. It's about whether they're Jewish or not. And non-Jews don't deserve the same respect in court, and we do anything we can to, make sure the Jew comes out on top. But if it's going to become a disgrace for the people and embarrass the Jewish people, think of the Bernie Madoffs and stuff like that, then we shouldn't do it. So again, if we stop there, we'd really be unhappy. So are there any questions, comments up until now? And welcome, Jane. Yofi. So the next thing here is the question that all of you are hopefully asking, which is, I bolded it here, Gezel Knani Mishare. And again, some of this language is Hebrew, some of it is Aramaic, is theft. The word Gezel, there's two words for stealing, Gezel and Lignov, Ganav, and they have different implications. But here, the Gezel is more like robbery, like straight out, like stealing someone from gunpoint. And Ganef, or Lignov, is more like through deception, like the way a ninja would break into your house at night. So is it permitted? Mishare, is it really permitted? Vehatanya, isn't it taught in another source, separate from the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Devarze Jarash Rabbi Akiva, that there was a teaching, an interpretation from Rabbi Akiva. Sheba Mezifirin. So Rabbi Akiva was coming from Zephirin. I actually Googled it. I don't know where it is. I'm sure I could find it if I looked a little deeper. Minayin legezel Knani shehu asur. How do we know that stealing from a non-Jew is forbidden? Oh, thank goodness. He says it's forbidden. Now all we need is a source. And then it brings a source from the Torah. It says Talmud Lomar. And when it says that, it doesn't actually mean the Talmud, this book. Talmud Lomar means it's taught from a verse in the Torah. The verse is from Vayikra, very close to where we're learning right now. And the verse is Acharei Nimkar Geula Tielo. After he is sold, his redemption shall be for him. So the context is this. A Jew or an Israelite is sold to a non-Jew. If we want to save that Israelite, that Jew, we cannot just go take him. We actually have to pay the fair market value to the non-Jew, which means you can't steal from non-Jews. You can't steal from them. They have every right to the same level of business ethics, etc., as everybody else. Beautiful. We get that. Ella continues, Amar Rabba lo kasha, kan b'gzelo ve'kan behafka'at halvato. So we had resolved it all. Stealing is not okay. Non-Jews have the same level of respect and fairness in business. We don't mess with them. We treat them equally in the eyes of the law. But then Rabbah comes along and says, fine. So we don't straight out steal from them, but no one said anything about this thing, hafka'at halvato, which is getting out of paying back a loan. And as my wife and I are about to take a loan out on a house, we know very well how important loans are to be honest in them, but how horrible with that. And again, people have accused Jews because of the kol nidre, all the vows, of not keeping their word. So to think that Jews have this in the Talmud that says, oh, you can't steal from a non-Jew, but you can come up with, oh, I lost the loan document, that's not my signature. You can use deception to get out of paying a loan. Again, if we left it there, we're not happy right now. Conversation continues. Amara Bibi Bar Gidel, Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Gezel Kanani Asur. So he says, stealing from them, straight out stealing is not forbidden, is totally forbidden. But there's something based on the Mishnah, something that we're allowed to do. And he says, Avedato muteret. Gzelo Asur, which is there's a mitzvah in the Torah to return lost items. And hopefully all of you will have an opportunity to do that. I was able to do it for someone today. It's a good feeling, but it's a mitzvah to return someone's property to them. But it says here, stealing from non-Jews is forbidden, but there's no obligation to return their lost property. So I can't go into a non-Jew's house and steal their wallet. But if I find their wallet on the street, I can keep it. That's really where we are. And then they continue, De'amar Rav Huna, minayin legezel knani shehu asur. And by the way, they didn't reject that. We just left that idea of not needing to return lost property hanging. We'll come back to it. But right now, Rav Huna is talking about just theft. Minayin legezel knani shehu asur. So how do we know it's forbidden to steal from a non-Jew? From a verse in Devarim, ve'achalta et kol ha'amim asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha. So this verse is talking about when we go into the land of Israel, and God is going to give our enemies into our hands. And the word is literally, and you shall eat or consume all of the other nations, which again, it's probably metaphorical, you'll defeat them, which God will give into your hands. Noten lecha, and then bayadecha. So the understanding from this, here, I'll read the rest of it. Bizman shehen mesurim beyadecha. So at a time when you're in the land of Israel, and it's clear that God has given you authority over all of the other nations in the land, velo bizman she'ena mesurim beyadecha, but not at a time when they're not in their hands, meaning this, when we're in the land of Israel, in the Messianic times, or in the times of Joshua, Yehoshua, when we conquered the land and rule over these people, their stuff doesn't belong to them. It belongs ultimately to God, but we can take it. In other words, in this prophetic time, it's not stealing from non-Jews. It's spoils of war. So it's not about lost property or deception or anything like that. We simply conquer the people and all their stuff is ours. Now, separate from the ethical questions about that, people are like, okay, spoils of war it's an icky thing, but I validate that. But the troubling thing is, fundamentally, it doesn't reject the idea really of theft. It says the only reason you can't steal now is because, or maybe I guess it sort of does, that stealing is never okay. It would only be permitted when you conquer the land. So actually, I take that back. It is a fairly good source, even though it's kind of a weird one, to say that stealing from non-Jews is never okay. But spoils of war, that's permitted. But in both cases, straight out theft from non-Jews is not permitted. But now we come back to lost property. And again, we would think that every human being, creation of God, Jew, non-Jew, we should treat their property with the same respect. So it says, Avedato muteret, that keeping their lost property, it's permitted to not return it. Demar Rav Chama bar Guria Amar Rav, minayin le'avedata knani shehi muteret. So all these rabbis said, how do we know that it's okay to not return their lost property? Shnei Amar, and he brings a verse again from Dvarim, lechol avedat achicha. Because when it talks about the mitzvah of returning lost property, everything which is lost, avedah, it says the last thing of your brother, your ach. And non-Jews, they may be other humans, creations of God's, but in the language of the Torah, and this is not a crazy read, pretty consistently, ach, brother, refers to fellow Jews. Now that's not racist or anti-religion or anything like that. That's a consistent, tribal idea. Your brother is part of your religion. So this mitzvah, we like it to be universal, only applies to your achicha. Le'achicha ata machazir. To your brother you return, ve'iyata, and you do not machazir leknani, to a non-Jew. Again, we don't like that idea, but that's not a crazy read of this. But again, we've rejected theft, that gezel goy mutar, that's stealing from a non-Jew, but we have not rejected not returning lost property. But now they're gonna go back and say, like, we're, again, as I said, the whole thing here is refining this and responding to things that trouble the rabbis. All of the questions rolling around, marinating in your head, they have them too. Are you really going to say that these words are here where they only apply, or maybe let's say that these words here only apply where it does not come to your hand? In other words, if I see a wallet on the ground and it probably belongs to a non-Jew, I don't have to actively stand down or bend down and pick it up. Once I picked it up, though, then I've obligated myself, Jew or non-Jew, but I don't have to go out of my way to pick up or find the property, whereas a Jew I would. So it continues, le'adura, to mechayev le'adure, to return it, batra, after him. Aval hecha de'ate lidei ema lehadra. But are we really going to say where it does come into your hand, we're going to make a distinction that then you have to return it. So that's the question there. Are we making a distinction between with non-Jews where you only have to return their property if it happens to come in your hand? You're like, ugh, I picked up his pen. I guess I have to give it back. So Amar Ravina, and he brings here another verse. This is what they do. They bring verses to support themselves. And by the way, all of the troubling ideas that we've seen are not coming from the Torah. The Torah, the word of God, the written word of God, has actually come to help us out of these situations and give us a higher ethical standard in most cases, at least the way they're written. Matzeta de'ate li de mashma. But not in this case. Everything I just said, take back there. And it says what you find, the word there is matzah, is if you find it, and it comes into your hand, that's what we're talking about here. Tanya Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair Omer b'makom sheyesh chilo Hashem afilu avedato asur. So the verse from Devarim seems to say that, yeah, we're going to make a distinction here. You have to go out of your way to return lost property to Jews, but you don't have to go out of your way to return lost property to non-Jews. Now, again, that may not be what the Torah is saying. That's the way they're using it here. But I do want to repeat what I said. In general, the Torah is not the source of these troubling ideas. But again, this Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair comes along and says, if there's a possibility of Chilul Hashem, disgrace and embarrassment for the Jews, again, a Bernie Madoff situation, which just shows how much he was not truly an observant Jew, then you should even go out of your way to return their lost property and not keep it for yourself. So we don't really have a nice feeling. We have a nice feeling about stealing from non-Jews, or not stealing. With lost property, we don't. Amar Shmuel, Tuto muteret. So he goes on and he says, okay, we really shouldn't be dealing with theft or deception or even about lost property. But if they make a mistake in a 7-Eleven, we don't have to point it out. So before we get to the example, so if I go into a store and there's a non-Jewish person and I give him a $10 bill and I'm supposed to get $3 in change and he gives me a $2 in my benefit, Shmuel just said, you don't have to, it's not your responsibility as a Jew to say anything. And then it brings an example. The Shmuel Zaben Mikute Lakna. So Shmuel bought this golden bowl, which was worth a lot of money. De Dehava, Demar de Parzala, Lakna de Dehava. He bought it for the price of a silver bowl. Bemar de Parzala, be Arba Zuze, ve Avla le Chad Zuza. So the cost of the silver bowl was only four coins, when he really owed, doesn't tell us, let's say 10 coins or something like that. So he should have paid $10. The guy charged him 4, but just to cover his own, cover his own behind, he puts in an extra zuz, so he pays 5 instead. But he still ripped this guy off for 5 coins. And it seems the Talmud is like, that's fine. It's not your responsibility. It's the non-Jews. Maybe throw in an extra coin if you know you're coming out ahead in the deal. But again, we don't like that. And the last paragraph here is not going to make you any happier. Rav Kahana Zaben Mekute Mea ve'esrim chavita. So Rav Kahana bought from this non-Jew, and again, this is another word here, which may or may not be the original for a non-Jew, a kutian. But again, it means a non-Jew. 120 barrels, b'mea, for the cost of 100. He got 20 barrels for free. Ve'avla le chadzuza, and avla means swallowed up. Like he basically threw in, sunk in another coin, chadzuza. So he threw in one more coin so he wouldn't feel guilty or something like that, and the other guy wouldn't notice. Amarle Chazed de Allah, and he said to the non-Jew, and again, this really, I don't know if it makes you cringe, but it makes me cringe. Non-Jew, it's your responsibility to make sure that all these business, your responsibility to check the money. I don't have any responsibility towards you. Oi, hopefully you're all saying oi. And they bring a Kan Samichna Ravina, Zaban Dikla. So here's another story about Ravina, Zaban Dikla. So he bought this Dikla tree. Hava Vekute, Ohu Vekuti, him and a non-Jew actually went in a business deal together. Great. You're working together. You bought this tree together. You both put in the same amount of money. You should split the wood equally. Vekute letzalcha. Amar le lishmai, and Ravina said to his servant, his helper, Kadem ve'aiti, run ahead before me and the non-Jew get there. Me'ikaro, ve'aiti me'ikaro. And I want you to make sure that I get the best wood. I get the wood that's worth the most money. Instead of splitting it evenly, you give me the best. The kuti minaina yada, so that the kuti will never find out about it. So, Oy, you say, we started from the idea that taxmen were criminals, which everyone's fine with that, but they're not. If they're corrupt, then we still pay because that's our responsibility, but we don't, we be very careful with the money that's in their pockets too. It's not because they're tax people, it's because they're non-Jews. And stealing from a non-Jew is fine. No, 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 we reject that. We even bring verses from the Torah. Good, thank you, Rabbi Akiva, but then they say fine. But this idea that non-Jews have a separate system of justice keeps getting pushed, but it's narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. You can cheat them in court, no. You can deceive them out of a loan, no. You don't have to return their lost property, even then, no. You don't have to point out a mistake if it's in your favor. And we never really rejected that one. So the question is, what do we do with this now? And there was one theme that kept popping up again and again and again, which is even when it's permitted, you still don't do it if there's a chance they'll find out, which doesn't make things any better. But before we go on to our sections about how is this actually covered and understood and dealt with by later rabbis, are there any questions up until now? Yeah, Samar, go ahead. You just got to unmute on your side. Go for it.
In the time of the Talmud and these debates, they lived among non-Jews. They had to make a living. How could they come up with these ideas that it's allowed to do to a non-Jew, but not to a Jew, if you need to get along business-wise?
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to approach that. I mean, one of the things is, remember, this conversation happened over generations, over hundreds of years, from the Mishnah to the closing of the Talmud. So it's like a 500 plus year period. So it reflects a lot of different times and sensibilities. Also, some of these rabbis come from different parts of the world and from all over medieval Europe and Babylonia, et cetera, like that. So the relationships they would have had, and also these rabbis are different people. Some of them are more sensitive, some are more harsh, but the amount of anti-Semitism and the amount of how much they would have been cut out of business could be a factor there. Meaning, if the perspective is non-Jews are cheating us 1,000 times worse, we're just saying when you have an opportunity, and a very limited way is, look, they cheat us left and right, they won't give us money, they beat us, they enslave us, all these things like that. So when we go into the gas station, if they give us a little extra change, we're not going to say something. Again, technically that shouldn't be okay. But look, if we can get away with that, fine. But if it's going to be a disgrace to the Jews who need to be a sacred people and representatives of God, don't even bother doing it. Now, again, that's not a good question to the underlying ethical morality of equal justice for all human beings. But whether or not the answer is nice and feel good and touchy-feely, it's probably reflective of the kind of world in which these Jews lived, which is they were getting ripped off and treated as non-equal citizens by the non-Jews. So the reality is that non-Jews probably were often corrupt officials who would steal everything they can from the Jews. There's ample evidence for things like that. So the question is, do you fight fire with kindness or do you fight it with fire? And that's kind of what this conversation is. Yet at the same time, the rabbis know we have a higher ethical standard. So there's a lot of pushback against, well, they deserve it because of what they did to us. But we're better than that, guys. And we're kind of left with a sort of in-between compromise, which is like, you know what? They're pretty bad to us, fine. Maybe you don't need to go out of your way to do the right thing, but certainly don't actively do the wrong thing. And if you think that it will disgrace the Jewish people in the name of God, definitely don't do it. So that's not an answer we like in the 21st century, but it kind of makes sense in context. Great questions, Mar. Any other questions before we move on? Beautiful. So Ed, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And what we're going to do now is look primarily at Mishnah Torah. So this is, another 500 years or so after, maybe not another 500 years, but hundreds of years after the closing of the Talmud. And Rambam, in his compilation of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, talks about these. And one of the things that we're going to look for is the things that were proposed in the Talmud. Fine, you can't steal from a non-Jew, but you don't have to point out their mistakes and about returning lost property. Which of those things actually get codified into law? And then how is it? How does the conversation look about the ethical conversation around it? So go ahead. This is the area of robbery and lost property. So go ahead, Ed, please. Source number 1 in section B.
It is forbidden to benefit from the property of people whom we can assume to be robbers, when all of their property can be assumed to have come from robbery, for their profession is based on robbery, e.g., customs collectors and highwaymen. We may not change money from their cash box, for all their money can be assumed to have come from robbery.
So this is basically the Mishnah, more or less word from word, which is tax collectors, but it includes the important reasoning and understanding of the Gemara, which is it's not about the fact that they're tax collectors, and it has nothing to do with their religion. That is very clear. It's not because they're Jews or non-Jews. It's because they're corrupt individuals, and we either can't, and it doesn't say we don't pay. It doesn't say we don't pay our taxes. It says we can't take benefit from the work that they do, which is basically the mission is don't get change from them. And even though you have to pay them, basically they're robbers and thieves. But again, here it's nothing about their religion. We're going to get to that in a moment. But here, the Mishnah he understands as being not about it being a non-Jewish tax collector, but about being a corrupt one. So the Talmud could have been read either way, which is, oh, it's because they're non-Jewish tax collectors. No, the Rambam rules it's because they're corrupt. That's actually fine. I'm fine with that. If we have corrupt individuals, we shouldn't be putting money into their coffers. But now we're going to get into the later part of the Talmud, which does make distinctions about religion. So Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And again, we're back in the Mishnah Torah. And here he gets to think about lost property. And again, as I said, the question is, what do we do with that thing in the Talmud? Do we actually rule it into practical Jewish law? And by the way, everything you see in the Mishnah Torah more or less makes it into the Shulchan Aruch, meaning this is reflected in accepted law. Whether or not people actually do it or hold by it, that's a question, but it is acceptable. So go ahead, please, Elizabeth, source number one. It is permissible.
It is permissible to keep an object lost by an idolater, for Deuteronomy 22.3 speaks of returning an object lost by your brother.
By the way, just pause there for a moment. One of the beautiful things about Rambam is not only makes everything clear, but if you're reading a source in the Talmud and you're not sure what's going on, read the Rambam on that section. Because first of all, you're like, oh, I understand that because we just learned the Gemara on it, but it goes both ways. He helps clarify what the conversation in the Talmud is really about and boils it down into the practical takeaway. So again, that verse about your brother and not a non-Jew, he brings that in. Go ahead. Indeed,
if one returns such an article, one transgresses a prohibition, for one strengthens the power of the wicked peoples of the world. If, however, one returns it to sanctify God's name, so that others will praise the Jewish people and know that they are trustworthy, this is praiseworthy. When there is a possibility of the desecration of God's name, it is forbidden to keep an object lost by an idolater, and it must be returned. As part of the ways of peace, we should always bring in their utensils from the outside, lest they be taken by thieves, as we do for utensils owned by Jews.
Now, one of the things I talked about is when you have an uncomfortable idea, what do? Do you throw it out? Now, the idea of just straight up stealing from non-Jews, that was essentially rejected. Nobody could accept that. So we essentially threw out the word of straight up theft, but then we refined it and said that's not what the Mishnah was ever talking about. So we sort of didn't throw it out. We threw out the idea of theft being what the Mishnah was talking about. We said, no, what the Mishnah is talking about ultimately is leading this conversation about lost property. But we still have that uncomfortable idea, which is I have no obligation to return lost property. Rambam makes it a little bit more uncomfortable by saying, if you find a wallet for a non-Jew, you shouldn't give it to him. Why? Because he'll take the money and go buy an idol to worship to some false god. Now, again, there's a lot of assumptions there, but then he says, if this is an opportunity, they find out Jews are not returning stuff, and they say, cursed Jews, disgusting, lying, deceptive Jews, which unfortunately plenty of people say, don't do it. But then he goes on and says that there's this thing called Darkei Shalom, which literally means the ways or pathways of peace. And it often refers to creating positive relations between us and non-Jews. And Tamar, to your question, talking about doing business with non-Jews, there's a lot of rabbis, particularly in the 13th century, that did a lot of work around relations between non-Jews to basically saying they're not idolaters, therefore you are allowed to do business with them because you need to do business with your brothers and your sisters from other religions. But here he says we should go out of our way to have positive relations with our non-Jewish neighbors if we see that they're they left their bike outside or their pot or vase, whatever it is, bring it inside, protect it for them. So the underlying thing here is still troubling, which is fundamentally you don't need to return it and probably shouldn't. However, what Rambam does is saying ethically, we really shouldn't practically do that because it'll be bad. And in fact, we should go out of our way as an opportunity to create positive relations. So what he's done is he's maintained the tradition. He has not rejected the Talmud, but created a reality in which we are better than the law that we have before us. The Jews can technically do it. That doesn't mean we should. And that's an idea which many religious and legal system explore. Just because you can technically get away with it, you probably shouldn't. And in fact, you should go above and beyond. And Elizabeth, if you want to take that next short one, please.
Mistaken accounts made by a Gentile is considered like a lost article, and it is permissible to benefit from it. This applies if he makes the mistake himself. It is, however, forbidden to cause him to make a mistake.
Again, this is right out of the Talmud. You can see it's literally the first one is chapter 11:3. This is chapter 11:4 in the Mishnah Torah, which is, again, the 7-Eleven thing. I go in there and a non-Jewish person gives me back too much change. Technically, I don't need to say anything. But then it actually continues on. And Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. He actually, the Rambam unpacks this mistaken account thing and gives us, again, that important thing about the desecration of God's name. So go ahead. What is implied? Like, what is this case that is in the 7-Eleven?
What is implied? A Gentile made an account and made an error in a Jew's favor. The Jew must tell him, look, I am relying on your account. I know only what you tell me. In an instant like this, if the Gentile does not correct himself, it is permitted to take advantage of his error. If, however, one does not tell him this, it is forbidden. It is possible that the Gentile's intent is to check the Jew's honesty. By keeping the money, one may cause God's name to be desecrated.
Thank you. So again, this is still pretty much right out of the Talmud, including that the language is in Hebrew as opposed to Aramaic, but it's that phrase of that rabbi who said, I'm relying on you. But even though the language isn't so fundamentally different, you can kind of get a different sense here, where that one is like, it's your responsibility, non-Jew, to count the money, where it's here is, I trust you. I'm not going to check the money. Whatever you give me, I'm assuming is the correct amount. If it happens to be I'm not going to say if it happens to be in my favor, I'll keep it. But again, there's a kind of different tone going on here in the Rambam, where he's reflecting the accepted law. And I don't know whether he's uncomfortable with it or not. I can't speak for his mind, but the way that he rules, though, is, first of all, it's only if it's a mistake. You cannot try and make him mess up. And then he says, it's also possible that the non-Jew's trying to trick you. He's trying to see if you're an honest Jew. So realistically, you should never do this anyway. So again, we get in that situation where, yes, technically, if the non-Jew messes up, you could keep the money, which even though it is part of our tradition, we don't love it. But Rambam says, look, I'm writing that down because that is the accepted law, but you should really never do this anyways because it's really unethical. So where we've ended up with all of this is, realistically speaking, I have to sneeze. That's not what I meant to say. It went away. It might come back. Realistically speaking, where we've left it at this point is fundamentally, there are some things that we would consider unethical that are permitted in Jewish law, but practically speaking, we should never do it because we might get in trouble. So when you do hear about these observant Jews who are ripping off people for millions of dollars, that's the extreme example of this. In their mind, they might think, oh, it's not entirely true, because a lot of these Jews stole money from fellow Jews. So it's, worse in many different ways. But ultimately, they might think, oh, as long as I can get away with it, it's fine. Well, they couldn't get away with it. And it's an absolute desecration of God's name. When this is all Maimonides, the question, somebody clarified. Thank you, Ed. Yep, thank you, Jane. This is Rambam Maimonides. Ramban is a little bit later. So again, all of these rulings here, we shouldn't do it because of what it'll lead to. And again, as I was saying, with these high profile criminals who were Jews, it really did hurt the name of the Jewish people. People already hated the Jews and thought we were deceptive criminals. This did not help anything. And one of the things here is, I can't really show you a source that rejects all of this, that makes it all nice and go away and says that non-Jews deserve the exact same. We might find some value statements that say that non-Jews should have the same level of justice and law. But practically speaking, in Jewish law, non-Jews are seen differently. Now, again, I don't want to say apologetics, but the flip side is that for other religions, Jews were often seen as not deserving of the same level of law. So it cuts both ways. But for the Jews here, we shouldn't take advantage of that if it's gonna get us in trouble. But the place I want to end it, again, doesn't fix everything, but it's a really beautiful story. And I'm not going to bother doing it in the Aramaic because it's the Talmud Yerushalmi, which has a very dense, beautiful Aramaic, but it's much, much more difficult to work through. So I'm going to, Jane, unmute and invite you to take this last source. And it's a really interesting story about the Shimon ben Shetach, very famous witch hunter. And there's another story for another time about that. He's a witch hunter. In this story where he had an opportunity to do exactly what we said. He had an opportunity to get away with cheating a non-Jew, and let's see what he does. Please, Jane.
Shimon ben Shetach was working with linen. His students said to him, Rabbi, in order to make it easier for you, we want to buy a donkey. Then you will not have to work so hard. They went and bought a donkey from a Saracen. A pearl was hanging on its neck. They came to him saying, because of this, you will not have to work anymore. He said to them, why? They told him, we bought for you a donkey from a Saracen, and a pearl is hanging on its neck. He asked them, does its owner know about this? They answered, no. He told them, go and return it. But did not Rav Huna, Beve Bar Gozlan, in the name of Rab, say they objected before Rebbe, even according to him who says that an object robbed from a Gentile is forbidden? Everybody agrees that what is lost is permitted.
And that's the conversation that we saw in the Babylonian Talmud. But go ahead, please, do you?
Do you think that Shimon ben Shetach was a barbarian? Shimon ben Shetach wanted to hear, praise be the God of the Jews more than any gain in this world.
So beautiful that Barich Elahehon Dihudae. Praised, blessed be the God of the Jews. For him, every opportunity in business is not what I can get away with. It's how can I use this as a beautiful moment to show people the ethical standards of the Jews and how God chose the right people. So it's not that if you said to Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach, technically speaking, do you have to return lost property to non-Jews? Are you rejecting this ruling that we have here from these great rabbis? And his response be, no, technically that's what's ruled. It will be ruled in the Mishnah Torah in hundreds of years, but that's not how we should approach business ethics. We should approach it as just because technically we can, we have a moral obligation to be better than that, to go above and beyond, to show people that God chose an ethical, moral people. Now, again, the underlying thing there that might grate us a little bit is we haven't rejected this troubling ruling, but Shimon ben Shetach allows us to live with that because every religion, every people, every country, every state, every city has some laws that might seem outdated, that might seem troubling or unethical, and they may even make sense in certain contexts. They may make perfect sense historically, and you might even defend it in its historical context. But he's not talking about why it started in the first place. He's talking about how to move forward. What should the Jews be? And the Jews should be better. They should be better than what they can get away with. Unfortunately, many people live their lives of trying to get away with stuff. Shimon ben Shetach sees every opportunity as a teaching moment to teach people how to be better. So again, this was an example of something that can be very, very troubling, how the rabbis struggled with it. They didn't necessarily land as far as we would have liked them to, but the beauty of our tradition is it's constantly adapting and responding, but without throwing it out. And that's the tension there. We do not reject or hate our tradition. We refine it. We're in conversation with it. And ultimately, the goal is to allow it, to use it to allow us to be better people, even if we learn from it or if we completely redefine what it was saying. The tradition lives. It's part of who we are. And part of who we are is trying to show the world that we want to be good people. And as I said, God chose well when God chose us.